One thing I can promise you is today's lesson could well be the highlight of your week. It seems like the videos where I've been showing myself giving a private lesson to somebody have been really popular, and that's something that I kind of want to lean into because giving those lessons makes me super happy. I really enjoy that process. It's a very fun part of what I do. So with that in mind, I'm going to bring you another one today, and this is a lesson between me and a chap called Alphonse, and Alphonse wanted to learn more about highlighting, specifically the method that I use that combines glazing with texture painting. And the idea here was that I wanted to demonstrate this to him in a fairly generalized context, but his aim was to be able to highlight blacks nicely with it. He'd seen my video recently for the Primaris Chaplain on bike, and he really liked the way the black was highlighted on that, and so that was what made him want to learn it in a little bit more detail. So with that in mind, I've given explanations that are fairly general, but what we're actually going to be displaying here is my highlighting method for black. So sit down, strap in. This one's going to be a long one. Let's highlight some black.
Yes.
Okay. So from here, I'll just pull my palette into the shot again for a second. So we've done that preliminary glaze. We've kind of mapped out where we want to start highlighting. Now what we want to do is just kind of push a little bit of this off to one side so that you've got some if you need to make any corrections. And then with the remainder, just add another blob of turquoise to it. So you've got a little bit there just if you do have to track back and fix a mistake. But what you've mostly got now is a colour that's just a little bit of a darker, desaturated turquoise. And as I said, we're not going to re-thin that. We're going to allow it to thicken from adding that extra paint as well. So what you'll notice now is when we glaze this in, it's going to be much stronger. It's going to affect the miniature much more dramatically. And we're going to need to just be a little bit more careful with it, just to make sure that where we're glazing it in, it's going within the boundaries of the previous glazes that we made. So we want this to be smaller. The shapes that we create with it want to be smaller than the previous ones. But like I said, if we make any mistakes, we saved some of the previous glaze, so we can always use that to darken it back down. We don't need to worry. But we just want to follow that guide that we created for ourselves in the last stage, and just start to build up stronger highlights now. So you can see that's one pass and it looks much more dramatic now, just on this leg here. But you can also see that it does blend back into the previous color. So it's not just you know, a sudden change of color. It's a very gradual, gentle change in color. I will say that realizing that the lighting information I needed for where to place my highlights was already present on the miniature. That was kind of a really big moment for me in understanding how to highlight miniatures. There's a lot of, you know, things like zenithal highlighting or zenithal priming, depending on what you want to call it. Techniques like that kind of encourage you to rely on, you know, some kind of trick or technique in order to inform your painting. And I always think that humans learn things, they absorb information easiest when it's given to them in a very natural way. And so that moment of realizing that, wait a minute, I don't need to do a zenithal highlight on this miniature because I'm going to be painting it under an office light, and that lighting information is already going to be there for me. That was kind of quite a big moment in helping me with my miniature painting in general. So I started to realize that that applied to a lot of different types of painting that we do. You know, a lot of the highlighting that we do, if we ever don't know where to place something, the first place we should probably look is where the miniature is actually reflecting light naturally. And we don't tend to do that. We tend to always kind of want a more direct answer, you know, for how to highlight. You know, like going back to the Warhammer TV kind of styling, you know, they always say to just kind of trace edge highlights around the edge of every shape, and that's definitely an approach you can take, and you know, and it will produce what appears to be a highlighted miniature. But that's kind of a look that it doesn't really appeal to me personally. So, you know, I sort of wanted a method that was just as easy as that, you know, just as easy to remember and to put into practice, but that gave me highlights that I liked the look of more.
What they were doing in the Warhammer TV.
Yeah. I mean, we will edge highlight during this process. You know, part of what we're going to do today will involve edge highlighting. I think the problem with it is because it's so simple as a concept, it can be very easy to just lean on it as the only way to highlight a surface. And some surfaces really, you know, don't benefit from that kind of highlighting. If we take something like this, for example, if we just used edge highlights on this, we'd lose all of this texture that's in the armor here. You know, all of this visual interest would be gone if we only used edge highlights. And you can see kind of on the back here, this probably illustrates it best. You know, we've got these kind of little dashy highlights, and then we've also got some blended highlights coming down here. And then, you know, when we get to sort of the front here at the brightest point, we're basically using edge highlights. And it's this combination of glazing, texture, and edge highlights all together, which is what kind of, you know, forms the way that I highlight miniatures. And I think it's, you know, it works well because it gives you a little bit of everything. You don't have to spend ages just doing one technique. You get to kind of switch up what you're doing every so often, and that kind of keeps it fresh and it's less mentally tiring. Because I'm sure you know this already, but fully edge highlighting a miniature is a very mentally tiring process. You know, it's really difficult to just sit there for 4 hours and edge highlight.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, I did it because I wanted to try it out and practice it, but this method to me is so much better.
I think it's easier. I think that's the key thing. If you prefer how it looks, that's kind of a subjective thing. That's kind of an individual thing. I personally prefer how it looks. That's why it's the technique I've developed. But the real difference between edge highlighting and this, you know, 3-step method that I use, the glazing plus texture plus edge, is really that this is much easier. You know, anyone can do this, and edge highlighting is very, very difficult to do well. You know, the actual kind of heavy metal standard edge highlighting, most painters I know can't do that.
I actually found it very difficult going in the shoulder pads and getting just a thin line.
Yeah. And there are techniques that can help with that.
But I also found it sort of unnatural to have just one thin line in something that's a rounded curved surface.
Absolutely, yeah.
So that's
yeah, as we can see on this shoulder pad, you know, we're kind of building highlights towards the top. And you can kind of still see it in the reflection on this one. You know, if the light source is above him, he has this sort of sphere of light forming on the shoulder pad. So just while you continue to highlight, and you don't have to do this step, so I'm going to show you this step whilst you're continuing to highlight because it's optional. But what you can now start to do is, if you take a nice black glaze, something fairly thin like this, any areas where it's just looking a bit too green, you can just kind of pull it back a little. And so there's just a few areas here where I want to just pull mine back a little so that it doesn't look quite so green. Again, completely optional because essentially it's, you know, it's how you want it to look. Obviously we want it to still read as black, so if, you know, if I think mine's going a bit too far where it's starting to not read as black, then I'll pull it back a little. But if I'm happy that it looks like a black surface with a cold highlight, which is what I want, then I will just leave it. The particular trouble areas for me are, I always find with Space Marines, it's the legs. You have to build up a lot of highlight on them, and by the time you've got it all in there, you can often start to just lose your color a little. So I'll often find that I'll just come back in.
So in this step, should I cover everything with the black glaze?
I'm just using the black to connect the darkest part of the glaze to the original base coat. So
okay.
I'm not dampening down the entire area. I'm just placing it in those transitions from the first glaze to the black, just to pull those down a little. And I think, you know, again, I said this is optional. I think it's very important when you develop a painting method, when you work with a painting system, that you're given freedom of choice. That there is not a right and wrong way to do things. And that you don't feel too kind of tied into not being able to make your own decisions. Because I think one of the most important things about painting is that it's creative, and the enjoyment of it mostly comes from feeling like you created something. So the system that you use to paint has to allow you to think freely. Otherwise, you don't feel like you're creating. And so that's why I say things like, you know, if you feel it's too green, then this is something you can do. But you don't have to do that if you don't feel it's too green. And with the first stage and that stage, that basically forms all of the sort of preliminary glazing part, and everything that we do after this now is going to start to be more texture based. How's he looking?
I feel it's looking really good.
Okay, so we're about to move into the pure texture part of it now. So we are still going to add this turquoise to our previous color again. You'll notice that the color that we get is almost exactly the same as the turquoise anyway. There's very, very, very little difference between these two colors. The only reason we're going to mix back into our previous glaze is just because it will very slightly desaturate it, and that's going to just stop it from looking too kind of neon green. We're not trying to you know, create a light show on the miniature. We don't want that kind of Tron look that edge highlighting gives. And again, you can see the brush is loaded very lightly, but the paint is now getting thicker. we just got that tiny amount of paint. And what I always say is that you should be able to see the entire form of your paintbrush. So what I mean by that, I've got this handy super zoom feature on my camera here where I can bring you really close. You see that I can actually see the shape of the hairs in the brush.
Yes.
So the hairs are holding the paint is not holding the hairs. And that's the important thing. If your brush is so heavily loaded that the paint is what's creating the shape of the brush, then you're not going to be able to predict how that brush behaves. So you want to make sure that you're taking enough paint off with your tissue that all of the hairs on the brush tip are clearly defined when you turn it over in the light. And the reason that that load level is so important is because now that we're getting into the stage where we're starting to put texture in, we're going to be painting off of the tip of our brush a lot. So again, I'll pull this super zoom in just for a second and show you what I mean. We're just going to be painting right off the very tip of the brush here and starting to place this texture. It's kind of a stippling motion, you know, you're kind of very, very gently stabbing at the area. And we want to keep this small, you know, we want to be being careful here to not be applying this over really large areas, because again, if we go too big with this, it won't read as black, it will read as green. We want something that assertedly looks like black with a cold highlight, not green with a black shadow. Yeah, right off the tip of the brush.
On the brightest parts.
Exactly, yeah. And just very, very gentle stabs close together, just to sort of form a little mass of dots of the colour that we want, essentially. And you can mix that with a few flat strokes and edge highlights where you wish to. Like I'll often just kind of quickly edge highlight. If I've got a long straight line like that, you can see I've just quickly just whipped my brush down there. Because it's a long straight line, you know, it doesn't need to have a ton of texture.
Would you size one brush?
Well, here's the thing. Brush sizes are a lie. Each company, their sizes will vary from one to the next. So it's not about finding the correct brush size, because that's going to be different depending on who you buy your brush from. It's about painting with the largest brush you possibly can to do the things that you're trying to do. So you can see that the tip of my brush is fine enough that I could easily paint the eyes in on this guy. I'll just super zoom again, and you can see that I can very, very easily get that eye without struggling at all. But this is a size 3 according to Rosemary & Co. And if you were buying something like a Raphael 8404, for example, which is another very popular brush for miniature painting, the size 2 would probably be closer. But Rosemary make their brushes a little undersized, so for Rosemary you want a size 3. But if you want a rule to tell you what kind of brush to use, then it's basically just the biggest one that you can stand. And the simple reason for that is because we're trying to get better at painting, which means that we're trying to develop muscle memory, right?
Yeah.
So if we're trying to develop muscle memory, we need to be spending the maximum amount of time possible actually painting our miniature. Any time that we're spending reloading the brush or changing brush or anything like that is time where our muscles are not developing that muscle memory that we're looking for. So by using the biggest brush that you possibly can, you minimize how often you have to change brush. You minimize how often you have to dip your brush into the paint again. You can see here, I've still not reloaded this. I don't think I've reloaded this from when I first started painting. And I'm already around the back of the miniature. You know, I've already done the entire front and I'm around the back now. I almost never have to reload this. And that means that I'm becoming much more comfortable with my tool. I'm getting used to applying paint with this brush. I'm developing that muscle memory, and so my ability with the brush will increase faster because I'm not wasting time. I don't know whether you saw the video that I did where I talked about paints and brushes, but essentially I only actually use 3 brushes. I have an old beaten up brush that I use for applying glue, applying texture paints to the base, that kind of thing. I have this brush, and then I'll usually keep something like a flat brush or a filbert brush, something with a big wide head on it that I use just for painting really, really large things like tanks. And outside of that, I don't need any other brushes. You know, I can do everything with those 3 brushes, and most of the things I do with just the 1 brush. So I'm just getting to the top here. This is my largest open section, and this is a good time to demonstrate some forced texture. So what I'm doing is I'm still just using that kind of very stabbing, very careless motion to go around all the edges here. And it's much like you would for an edge highlight, you know, you're just following the outside edges. But every so often what I'm going to do is actually just streak a little line inwards towards the center, just to make a little scratch. Just off the very, very tip of my brush. I'm just going to pull a little line, maybe add a dot here or there, and just create something on the surface that just has a few little kind of scratches and stuff.
Okay. So even if it's a black area, I can go, for example, here on my leg.
Yeah, you can go right into the black area. Yeah, it looks better if you go into the black area because it will create that contrast for you. Okay, so that texture's building in nicely now?
I think so, I don't know.
What I'm going to do is I'm just going to take a photo of this with my phone's camera, because my phone's camera happens to be really bad at making texture look a lot harder than it makes the textures look sort of much grittier than they look in real life. But for showing people how to paint them, that can actually be kind of helpful. So I'm just going to take a couple of photos with my phone's camera and I'll send them to you. So you'll see that the glazes are quite smooth, but now that I've switched to the textured highlights, I'm actually being quite rough. I'm deliberately making texture, forcing texture. Cool. So yeah, like to the naked eye, it looks a lot finer, but and you know, fortunately, this camera, my big expensive one that is watching us paint right now, is pretty good at making things look quite similar to how they do to the naked eye. But one of the advantages of crappy phone cameras is that they quite often pronounce texture. They make texture look a lot stronger than it should. And so when we're trying to demonstrate how to paint with texture, it's actually quite helpful. So that might be something to bear in mind if you're ever struggling with the stuff that you're painting and you're not sure about it. Take a photo of it with your phone camera and see if it looks textured enough. Try to remember to support your hand that's holding your paintbrush. If you stab from here, free-handed, with nothing to guide your hand, it's very easy to misstroke. If you keep your hands touching each other like this, and you just use the movement in your fingers to move your brush instead of your wrist, that'll help you make sure that you always place the strokes where you want them. And you'll be surprised how much range of movement you have with just your fingers. You know, initially you'll feel very restricted, but you can paint quite long lines just off the movement of your fingers. You know, I mean that's probably about as long as a line would ever be on a miniature, right?
Yeah.
And that was, you know, from this anchored position. You'll see, because I'm anchored, it's also easier for me to like stay parallel, for example. And obviously, you know, I'm painting on my hands here, so it's not the neatest in the world, but things like parallel lines become a lot easier if you become used to staying anchored like that, keeping your hands touching each other. What it essentially does is it just means that if one hand shakes, the other hand shakes with it, so your relative brush position doesn't change. And again, it's just that thing of that's better for your muscle memory, because your muscle memory hasn't got to kind of judge where your brush is before you make the stroke. As long as to you it feels like it reads as black. And again, you know, it's another really important thing to remember is that a degree of that is going to be subjective. You know, it needs to read black to you. You can't ever judge. Your head doesn't know what other people are going to think of your work. So you have to get used to just being confident that the way you want to do something is the way you're going to do it, because you can never predict how other people are going to feel about your choices. And so when I say, you know, make sure that it reads as black to you, mine is quite a lot greener than yours, it looks like. I don't know if it is, because obviously the difference in our cameras, but mine looks quite a lot greener than yours. But to me, this still reads as black, but with a green highlight, which is what I'm looking for.
I think by the photo that you sent, it looks a little bit exactly the same. I can take the photo so you can see.
Yeah, that'd be great. If you could send me a photo over Twitter, that'd be brilliant, yeah. And we can move on to our next stage then. So now we're going to be starting to work with paint that's really pretty much at full thickness. It's the only real thinning here is what the wet palette naturally gives the paint and what having a wet brush naturally gives the paint. But at this point, we're not really looking to add any water to our paints from here on. So we have this turquoise, and you're going to see how little white we want for the first load. This much. Very, very, very small amount.
So just a very, like this amount?
Yeah, just sort of the tip of the brush. Maybe two little tips of the brush. But you'll see that I'll actually lighten this paint quite a lot. White paints are actually very, very strong. And often when we mix highlights, we use white because that's what our brain tells us to default to. And in a lot of cases, it's not necessarily correct. Like I said, I like to use icy yellow quite often. But one of the things that we forget about white is that it's the highest value you can add to another color. So if you add a large amount of it straight away, you're going to move really far away from your previous color. So in much the same way as when we built up the first couple of pre-glazes to prepare for this highlighting. Oh yeah, this looks great. Yeah, that's lovely. And it definitely does still read as black, I agree. So yeah, much in that same way as the first two shades were very close together. You know, the first shade that we applied was just above black, and then the next shade that we applied was just above that. Now that we're getting into our highlight colors, we really want to just come up by a tiny small amount for the first one. And again, we're loaded very lightly, and this is where we really need to start thinking about just small strokes. And we can add our texture, little dots and dashes and the such like.
So would this be still like stippling or just?
We're going to be kind of doing a mix. We want to be mostly just very carefully placing our paint by this point, because we're really getting quite bright with our highlights now. So we need to really be in full control of where they live. So a lot of this is just placing paint off of the tip of the brush. I'm trying my best to keep my head from under the camera. I'm sorry about that. You can see how I'm placing this paint, just very slowly, very carefully, keeping my hands tightly locked together so that I've got complete control. And again, we can just make texture when we want it, where we want it. One of the really nice things to do is, if you've painted a texture line that's quite thick, placing a thinner texture line inside it looks really nice if you fancy the challenge of trying to paint a really fine line. So for example, I had one just here. I had a line that was thick and I've just painted a thinner line inside it. And it's you know, it's tricky. It's not the easiest thing in the world to do, but it looks really cool. So it's worth the effort if you're willing to try it. If you don't feel comfortable trying to paint super thin lines straight away, then you can kind of just wait until you do. And you never really need to force yourself to paint anything that you don't want to paint. It has to be fun.
No, I like challenges. That's actually what makes painting fun for me, is trying to do things that I don't normally do.
Sure, yeah. That's a good attitude to have if you're trying to improve. That will help a lot.
Because that's exactly the idea. It's I want to be the best that I can be in my perception.
Of course, yeah.
It's like where I actually feel happy with what I'm producing.
And you know, I'll be honest with you right now, as someone who's been doing this for almost 30 years, there's every possibility that you never reach that point. You know, it can be really difficult to be happy with your own painting. But one of the things that's really important to trying to achieve that goal is understanding that you are the measuring stick, not other people. One of my Twitter followers, for example, said to me yesterday, was it yesterday? No, I think it was earlier today, actually. Said to me, you know, your work looks easily as good as people who I see winning competitions. Like, why don't you enter competitions? And I said to him, you know, it's just not my goal for my work. Surrendering the value of my work to what other people want to see doesn't help me become a better painter. It helps me learn how to please others more. And if I'm painting entirely for other people to decide whether or not my work is good, it's very hard for me to feel proud of my work. You know, I'm relying on somebody else liking it in order to feel proud of it. And a lot of what people don't realize about these competitions is that a lot of the criteria that judges judge on are preference based. You know, it's not all scientific. It can't be. And so, you know, people who enter these competitions, I mean, I have a huge amount of respect for them, because personally I could not put myself in that position where the validity of my work relied on somebody else's opinion of it. You know, that to me would be, it would be too easy for me to lose inspiration or desire to create in that situation. Which is why I don't enter competitions anymore. I used to when I was younger, but it's just not a goal that I have for my painting anymore. You know, I want to, like you said, I want to be the best painter I can be, not the best painter someone else tells me I can be.
I have entered one competition, and I just entered it because I painted a Lord of the Rings diorama for fun, and it was my local gaming store. Since in lockdown they decided to do these small competitions to keep the community entertained while we couldn't go to the store.
Of course.
And I just did it for fun because I painted the diorama because I'm a huge Lord of the Rings fan.
Right.
And I was pretty happy with it. And I could care less where I placed.
Well, yeah, I mean, I definitely think that's a great thing. If you can make something and you love it enough that you're proud of it no matter what, and then, you know, a competition comes along and you're like, oh, well, I may as well enter this, you know, I already love it. Personally, I being completely honest with you, I just don't have the strength of character for that. I really care what other people think about the things that I do. So if I voluntarily ask people to judge my stuff, it's a very fast and slippery slope towards upsetting myself. And I think, you know, some of that definitely comes from the fact that it's my job. Like, it's, you know, it's one thing to be told you're good at your hobby. It's another thing to be told you're good at the thing that you make a living doing.
Yeah, no, I understand.
And that's why I say, you know, I have so much respect for these competition painters. I just don't think I could ever be one of them. I'm doing a little bit of extra edge highlighting here. I don't know whether you spotted that or not, but now that I'm onto these brighter colors, I'm starting to highlight some of my downward facing edges. And that's just for definition. It's not necessarily realistic. It just looks cool, and it helps kind of make the area pop. So I like to do it just because it looks cool and makes the area pop. You know, it's not something you should be doing by any measure, but you may want to look at some of your kind of downward facing edges once you get up to these brighter colors. One thing that looks really cool, I'll just use your photo here to explain because I can zoom it a bit better. Now that you're getting onto your brighter highlights, you see just this rim under the Space Marine's eye lenses.
Yeah.
If you can pick that out with the tip of your brush, and the ridge down the front of the grill here, really, really helps to define them. Makes the helmets look a lot stronger, a lot fiercer. Remember, if you do make any mistakes that you're really unhappy with, we made a deliberate point of saving our previous colors. So we can go back and just grab a little of our previous color and make little micro corrections if we need to. For the next highlight, we're going to be stepping up quite a bit in brightness this time. Mine's just starting to dry out a tiny bit as well, so I'm just going to add a little spot of water to it. So you see we're coming up to this sort of pale, kind of mint colour. Very, very pale.
So another dot of white.
Quite a big dot this time though. I went probably twice the amount that I added last time.
Something like this.
That looks good. Yeah, that looks good. I mean, there's the colour painted onto my skin so that you can see how pale it is.
Okay. Yep.
It's funny. It's funny. I'm kind of used to my own colour mixing now, so I don't really test my paint on my hands this much unless I'm giving lessons. And every time I've given a lesson recently, I've come away with just the most filthy, disgusting hands from all this paint that I put on them.
That's actually the way I do it consistently.
The hand palette, yeah. A lot of people really like the hand palette.
So at the end of my painting sessions, I have hands covered in paint.
Right. Again, it's exactly the same process that we went through last time. We're just shrinking our areas down again, getting smaller with the size of our highlights. So this is where we have to start to, you know, really exercise our brush control. And that's why I mix the 3 different techniques together. Because when you edge highlight from the start, you're exercising all this really fine brush control from when you first begin highlighting your miniature. Whereas with this method that we're using today, we don't have to start to do this really fine brush control until the very end of the highlights. We're only doing one more highlight after this. So we're almost at the end of the highlights now. And we're only just starting to really have to be careful with how we place paint. And so that just means that we get a much larger proportion of our painting time spent relaxing and, you know, having fun. And again, you can still bring in those little texture lines if you want them. If you want to create those scratches. Every time you're adding a brighter highlight, adding more scratches just kind of makes the scratches all look sort of layered up. It's a really nice effect. So always feel free to add more of them if you want them. It's really down to your taste, how scratched you want everything to look. You remember when I did the Chaplin on bike, which I think was the first miniature that you saw. Was it the first miniature you'd seen of mine at all, or was it just the first miniature that you saw with this technique?
That was the first video.
Right.
Because I do follow you on Instagram.
Oh, on Instagram?
Yes.
That's the social media I pay the least attention to. Actually, that's probably not true. Facebook's probably the social media I pay the least attention to these days. Because Warhammer Facebook is a toilet.
Yeah, I don't really use Facebook anymore either.
I just find that the Warhammer community on Facebook is not quite as friendly as it is on Twitter and Instagram.
I actually just use Instagram and Twitter for posting my photos because I find it extremely welcoming.
Exactly, yeah. Twitter particularly is very, very welcoming. It's a really nice community on Twitter. And that's, you know...
Facebook, I mean, all types of people.
Well, I think a lot of the difference is that because Facebook was kind of the first major social media platform, a lot of people kind of became entrenched there first, you know, and so whereas like Twitter's kind of known as being a place where, you know, liberal types like to hang out, for want of a better expression. You know, Twitter is generally quite a liberal led platform, And those types of people just tend to lean more towards, you know, trying to be welcoming and inclusive naturally. Whereas I think, you know, with Facebook, because it's been around for such a long time, it's managed to serve as a home for people that are maybe a little bit less friendly. I'm not sure if you saw this or not, but when I'm putting a lot of these highlights in, I'm actually just using the side of the tip of my brush. You've probably seen that technique before.
Yes.
So instead of using the point of my brush, I'm actually just laying my brush flat to the surface that I'm highlighting like this. And you can see that we need, you'll notice that each step takes less and less time. That's the other kind of little trick with this painting methodology, is that as the steps get harder, we spend less time doing them. So whilst these last couple of steps are the most difficult because we're placing the paint in the most careful and considerate way, they're also the shortest, which means less opportunity for mistakes, less opportunity to get frustrated. The first thing I want to teach you is a really, really important rule. You may know this already, so stop me if I'm teaching you something that you're already aware of. But the colour white doesn't really occur in nature. Things that we observe as being white are almost never actually white. So here's a great example. This bottle of varnish, you would call that a white liquid, right?
Yeah.
I think we would easily agree that that is a white liquid. However, it's definitely not. Do you see the difference between the paint and the liquid?
Yep.
So once we understand that almost nothing that we perceive as white is actually white, we can then learn from that when we paint, we should almost never be using pure white. The only time we should be using pure white is when we're simulating the brightest point of a reflection or a light source. So this armor, we have to assume this is not polished, right? Because we're painting like a textured armor. So we have to assume that this isn't a polished finish, because otherwise why would we be using this textured highlight? So with that considered, our final highlight needs to stop before it gets all the way to white. So we dump a bunch of white into our previous color, and we get all the way up to this like off-white. And you can see if we put it next to our white, it's definitely not white. You know, this is definitely still quite green. But once we put it in context with all of our other highlights, it's going to magically look like white because the context that we've created on the miniature is based on these green tones. So we're just really looking for the tiniest little dots just in corners, sharp points, areas where the light is focusing.
White.
Well, it's a very common thing to do, but this is why I say it's quite an important rule to learn, because when you actually think about it, there's almost nothing in the real world that is pure white. And so, you know, we can spend our entire lives as miniature painters creating these really massively unrealistic looking miniatures, and we can never figure out what's wrong with them. And quite often, one of the first things, if somebody asks me, you know, something isn't right about this, what have I done here? And I'll look at it, and many, many times it's been the fact that it's highlighted all the way up to pure white. You can see in my example, it's not as if we don't get enough brightness. I mean, look at this hand here. You know, this off-white. Sorry, I cut you off there. What were you going to say?
No, that's really bright.
That's what I mean. Like, there's no shortness of brightness present, but if we actually compare the color of this paint next to pure white, you can see we're a long way off. And that's a strange thing, because we often don't realize that we don't need to go all the way to pure white in order to get a lot of brightness. We always think that if we need to brighten something up, we need to go closer to white, and it's quite often not the case. And don't get me wrong, you know, as I said before, like, I accept that we're painting such tiny, small highlights at this point that it becomes quite difficult. But that's exactly why we're doing almost none of it. You know, that's why we're just doing the tiniest little amount of it, because we don't want to spend too much time working on the really difficult parts of the miniature. Gonna finish off my edge highlights on this shoulder pad here. Again, just corners, the most raised or tightest parts. You know, we really don't need a lot of this to do a lot of work. And I think maybe just a little bit more on the hands here. And that's probably as far as I would take it. And again, you know, to me, that still feels like black. It's just stylized. And coming out of that lengthy session sat down together, what do you think? Do you like this method for highlighting? Do you think this is a useful method for highlighting? As I believe I said during that footage, I hope I captured the part where I said this because I know I said it. The technique is about making things easy and producing a result that looks good but is a little bit quicker than the painstaking methods that you would have to use to get the finest result. It's about finding that balance between refinement and speed, between putting pressure on yourself and between just having fun and doing it for the love of it. And I think that what I've found, at least for me, for how I paint, is a really, really nice balance of that. So passing it on to other people is really, really rewarding for me. Now, after we'd finished that lesson, Alphonse did send me a couple of Twitter messages just to say that he was really, really happy. And he also made a Twitter post showing another miniature that he'd painted without my help. And you could see an instant improvement just after that first lesson. So that was brilliant. I'm really looking forward to seeing more of his results using this technique, but I'd also love to see your results if you've used this technique. So get at me on social media and let me know. If you've used the techniques that I teach in this video or in any other videos, make sure that you tweet me, let me know, because that's something that I'd really, really love to see. So folks, if you liked this video, don't forget to hit that like button. And of course, you can subscribe to the channel and enable notifications to get updates on what I'm doing on the channel. You'll be notified every time I release new content. There is also a Patreon campaign, which is what keeps the lights on, keeps me able to do this full time. And if you want to subscribe to that, tiers start from as little as $1 American a month. You can get some fantastic benefits there, including access to my Discord and early access to a lot of my videos. So folks, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.